State. Working in collaboration with Mural Arts Guild members of the Restorative Justice Program and considering empathy as a framework for social change, Walls's culminating video will be projected onto the dramatic facade of Eastern State Penitentiary during Night Tour's Summer Twilight. So make sure to tune in for that program next month. Tonight, we'll be discussing a new report from Impact Justice called Eating Behind Bars, Ending the Hidden Punishment of Food in Prison. This six-part report is the first national investigation of its kind and is, in my opinion, required reading for anyone interested in the topic of food in prison. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to tell you a bit about food at Eastern State Penitentiary in the hope that it can provide some historic context for our conversation this evening. When Eastern State opened in 1829, incarcerated people ate alone in their cells. In the prison's early years, feeding holes, like the ones pictured here, lined the corridor and meals were delivered to people in their cells using carts. Here's a food cart that remains suspended from a cell block gallery. While most feeding holes were removed in the middle of the 19th century, the practice of eating alone continued until the 1920s. And in the middle of the 1920s, two dining halls were constructed in what used to be the private exercise yards of cell blocks 4 and 5. Since the prison's kitchen had always been in this location, it made sense that the new dining halls would be built here as well. Sandwiched between two cell blocks, the dining halls earned the nickname Soup Alley for their long and narrow design. Soup Alley could seat about 700 people at a time, so each meal was served in 2 shifts. Menus from different eras give us a sense of what food was like at Eastern State. For example, this menu tells us that for breakfast on a Tuesday in mid-April 1949, people at Eastern State ate grilled stewed fruits, cornflakes, fresh milk and sugar, syrup, bread, and coffee with milk and sugar. The fare sometimes included regionally specific foods like scrapple, which is a congealed loaf of pork scraps and trimmings mixed with flour and spices that are sliced and fried. You can see that folks would have eaten scrapple on Monday for breakfast. It was not uncommon for incarcerated people at Eastern State to grow food within the walls. A newspaper from 1917 reported that, quote, "Every available foot of land within the penitentiary walls is being utilized for gardens. On the roofs are many more carefully tended vegetable plots," end quote. At one point, there was actually a butcher shop at Eastern State as well. Special meals were served on holidays, and occasionally food could be brought in from the outside. For example, volunteers sometimes brought in kosher food for Jewish prisoners during Passover and other holidays. There was even a food preparation area inside the prison synagogue, which is pictured here. By the time Eastern State closed in 1971, the landscape of food in prison began to shift noticeably. The rise of mass incarceration has altered the quality, quantity, and experience of food in prison in profound ways, which brings us to tonight's conversation. So tonight, we welcome 3 amazing panelists to explore the quality and consequences of food in American prisons: Leslie Sobel, Catherine Stroud, and Wayne Williams. Leslie Sobel is a research fellow for the Food in Prison Project and the lead author of Impact Justice's recent report, Eating Behind Bars, Ending the Hidden Punishment of Food in Prison. An ethnographer and folklorist, Leslie holds an MA in Cultural Sustainability with a focus on the intersection of foodways, narrative theory, and social practice art. Welcome, Leslie. Catherine Stroud is a research analyst at Impact Justice. In addition to supporting the Food in Prison Project, her research includes evaluating governmental and community-based organizations, analyzing disparities in the criminal justice system across race, gender, and sexual orientation, and providing training and technical assistance around data management and processes for partner agencies and organizations. Welcome, Catherine. Wayne Williams, after serving 35 years in the federal prison system, currently resides in Philadelphia as a returning citizen. A project coordinator for the Food Trust with a background in reentry, Wayne delivers nutrition education and food access support classes to returning citizens and participants at the Riverside Correctional Facility for Women as part of the Food Trust work in addressing food insecurity in underserved communities. Welcome, Wayne. All right, let's get to it. So can I ask each of you to tell us how you became involved in this project? Leslie, if it's all right, we'll start with you, and then Catherine, and then Wayne.
So when I was in graduate school, I remember having a conversation with a friend about food and identity. And we were talking about, oh, how do people continue to express identity through food if they're incarcerated when that access is limited? And I just sort of filed that idea away into the back of my head as, oh, maybe that would be a project that would be interesting to look at some point in time. Fast forward a couple years later, I saw a posting on idealist.org for this organization that was starting a study of food in prisons and looking at the impact of prison food on health. So I sent in a cover letter and said, hey, in addition to physical health, let's look at how it's impacting mental health, people's sense of self-worth, people's ability to interact positively with others, how the eating environment impacts people's health as well. And here I am.
Awesome, thanks. I look forward to unpacking all of those things. Catherine.
Yeah, I wish I had more of like a Kismet story like Leslie does. But Impact Justice is a national research innovation center. And one of our big projects or big areas of research or big areas that we work in is called innovations. And Food in Prison is part of our innovations sort of portfolio of projects. And what we do with innovations is kind of try to take a newer idea or an idea people aren't really talking about and see what we can do in that space, see what Impact Justice can offer to this conversation. And Food in Prison was something no one seemed to be talking about. And so when we started this as one of our innovations projects with Impact Justice, we often bring in a researcher because the first step is understanding the landscape. And so I'm a researcher at Impact Justice who happened to join the team of Leslie and then our other partner, Mika.
Awesome, thanks, Catherine. And how about you, Wayne?
I came into the food trust and interested in the food process as it relates to returning citizens. I was actually working with another nonprofit organization addressing returning citizens. And during that process, during that time, we were doing a research project, and the research project was tuning in on trauma and trying to understand trauma. And at that time, doing the research and doing study on trauma in itself, it actually connected me with what we call malnutrition and the effects of a poor diet on the brain. And that to me, that was like interesting. It was interesting to me because I was suffering from that and did not know that, nor did I know why. And so when I began to look deeper into nutrition and the problem of lack of nutrition to not just the body, but to the brain, it became something that I became more and more interested in personally. And then when I came to the food trust and looked at their project, working with returning citizens, I saw it as an opportunity to help returning citizens to identify some of the impediments that we may have that's internal.
Thanks, Wayne. Thank you, everyone. So Leslie, why is it important for us to think critically about food in general? And why is it especially important to examine food in prison?
What and how we eat really impacts every aspect of who we are. And food blurs the lines between our biological selves and our cultural selves. We have to eat to survive, but every culture has both implicit and explicit rituals and traditions regarding food. And food, as we all know, as I'm sure everyone listening here tonight can relate, connects us to people, to places, to memories, to seasons, to the rhythms of our daily lives. And we use food as a tool to communicate identity and relationships and values. And none of that essential relationship to food changes just because someone is incarcerated. But the prison eating experience disrupts that healthy and positive relationship to food, and it sends a message both to and about the people who are incarcerated. And it's telling them, you are less than human, you are disposable, you are not worthy of care. And the impacts of hearing that message meal after meal, day after day, for years, or even for decades for some people, can have a really profound impact on someone's sense of self-worth.
Absolutely. Thank you. Catherine, can you walk us through the scale of this study? How many people were interviewed? Where do they live? And what's their connection to this topic?
Yeah, so it is a national review of food in prison. So we wanted to understand the entirety of that landscape surrounding prison food in the United States. We did focus specifically on adult state correctional facilities. So it includes interviews, focus groups, and surveys conducted with those who've experienced incarceration firsthand, as well as their loved ones. We got about 400 surveys from incarcerated folks and their loved ones. 250 of them were incarcerated, had been previously incarcerated themselves. And that included about 40, I think it included 40 states, with the average respondent having left a facility within the past 5 years after having spent 5 to 10 years there. We also, in addition to like the survey, did a systematic review of food-related policies, procedures, and practices at state correctional agencies. We also conducted site visits and interviewed DOC, Department of Correctional leaderships and decision makers. And then because what often happens is this work is conducted in silos, and we really wanted to ensure that it was a cross-disciplinary review. We also met with and reviewed information from experts in nutrition, mental health, public health, law, sociology, economics, and a whole bunch of other areas as well. So yeah, it was a national review in all senses.
It sounds incredibly thorough. A follow-up question for you. What were some of the challenges of conducting a survey of this kind?
Yeah, there were some. There are many details, not to plug the report again, but there is a full methodology section that sort of unpacks a lot of these. But the first and important one is it's 250 people for a system that touches millions and millions of people. And so to imply in any way that these are really the voices of all the people who've been impacted by the system would be a disservice to, an injustice really, to the people who have been touched by that system. However, what we did learn from this survey were really resounding answers to the questions we asked. There were not like half answers when we asked if people had experienced getting rotten food served to them or spoiled food. 75% of people who responded to the survey said so, that they had experienced that. And so the challenge is a representative sample, which this is not, but we do think that the stories that we got to hear from the survey were very important and impactful.
And Leslie, can you give us a general sense of what food in prison is like today? What are some of the common characteristics you found in this research?
The food does vary from state to state and facility to facility. And part of the problem is that there isn't actually any type of national standard around prison food. But like Catherine said, there really were some nationwide patterns that were showing up. The first one is quantity. So 94% of our survey respondents told us that they didn't have enough food to feel full while they were incarcerated, either because the portions were insufficient. A lot of people compared them to elementary school cafeteria lunch size food, or because the food was simply too bad to eat. And second, in terms of basic quality, again, the food is just often simply too bad to eat. It can range from just bland and unappealing to flat out inedible and unsafe. And like Catherine just mentioned, 3/4 of our survey respondents reported that they had spoiled or rotten food. We heard from people who had things like cockroaches or pieces of metal in the oatmeal or chunky milk that was flavored with chocolate in an attempt to mask the spoilage. And third, in terms of nutritional quality, the overarching pattern is that prison meals tend to be really high in sodium and sugar. They're very high in refined carbohydrates, very low in nutrient-dense foods like fruits and vegetables and quality protein. Basically, people in prison are being served the diet that we're all told to avoid.
Wow. And Wayne, what are some of the consequences of poor food in prison that you see working with people returning to the community?
Some of the consequences that I see when I go into Riverside Correctional Facility and working with women in the nutrition education program is that the food, as Leslie said, the food that we are normally served in prison is really not healthy. The longer you stay in a prison environment eating that food, your body begins to adapt to that. Your taste buds begin to adapt to that. It becomes normal. But what is not normal is the effect of eating that food on a daily basis have on the body. But at some point, and I think the key takeaway is that it begins to also have effect on the mind and the brain. And that is a critical part of the study in itself, because when we think about how the brain is designed to function under those conditions, under those eating conditions, not just the food, but the environment in which that they're eating it. We find where women in particular at the Riverside Correctional Facility, they weight gain, diabetes, high blood pressure, all these things are a part of some of the bad, the diet that they are intaking inside the prison. The high dose of sodium and other elements.
Right. So as Wayne, you alluded to, we see that incarcerated people experience chronic illnesses like diabetes and heart disease at higher rates than people who aren't in prison. So Leslie, what's the relationship between the food that someone eats during their incarceration and the likelihood of developing a chronic illness?
Well, as we were describing, the typical prison diet is basically designed to cause or exacerbate conditions that can lead to those chronic illnesses. So things like increase in body weight, increased inflammation, blood sugar issues. So the likelihood of that leading to the chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, hypertension is actually pretty high. Even the so-called special diets that are served in prisons aren't necessarily ideal for these conditions. And we know that those kinds of chronic illnesses can be managed or even eliminated through changes in diet, but people who are incarcerated don't have the option of, for example, increasing their fruit and vegetable intake or increasing their fiber intake. And there are also other protective factors that people can't always have in prison, like access to exercise or access to solid night's sleep. And like Wayne mentioned, it's not just the chronic physical illnesses, but also the diet that's lacking in critical nutrients can cause those long-term mental health issues, which can range from depression to impaired decision-making to aggressive behavior.
Thank you. Catherine, how did currently and formerly incarcerated people describe their overall health in relation to their food experience?
I mean, probably not surprising given what Wayne and Leslie have said, is that most people who we talked about declining health, and that while inside and then outside, their health because of the food they ate, directly related to the food they ate, they were worse off from that experience. There was one of the family members of an incarcerated person had this comment to say that the costs that you're saving with providing terrible food, those costs show up elsewhere. And those costs showed up for her with her loved one who was experiencing really, really serious health issues while inside because of the food that he was eating. So yeah, that overwhelmingly, the people described having worse health having left prison.
So part 3 of this report takes a closer look at the design of dining spaces in prison. Leslie, can you describe how the architecture and design of a dining space can impact health outcomes for people who eat there?
Sure. So environment plays a big role in how we respond to food, both mentally and physiologically. And that's not just inside prisons, right? Because we experience this on the outside as well. If you dim the lights and you put on nice music and light some candles, those are the cues that put you in the mindset for like a romantic dinner, right? And restaurants use light and sound to set an atmosphere, use the design of the space to set an atmosphere. So looking at the prison chow hall, they're generally not comfortable spaces. People have described them as drab and bleak and nerve-wracking and stressful. There are metal tables and stools that are bolted to the floor. People can't necessarily choose who they sit with. It's usually loud in there. It's lacking in natural light. The spaces can be unpleasantly hot or cold. We heard about places that had mold on the walls or swarms of insects buzzing around, and everything is rushed. You might have armed officers shouting at you to hurry up and shovel your food down in 5 minutes. And people who've been incarcerated talked about feeling really unsafe in the chow hall. So most of us know that eating when we're rushed or stressed isn't great for digestion, but there's also actual scientific research that shows that, for example, natural light supports metabolic health, which is important for your physical functioning. And exposure to artificial light can impact your blood glucose levels and your insulin sensitivity, and that can potentially increase the risk of obesity and diabetes. There's other research that shows that people who are in louder environments tend to eat fewer fruits and vegetables, or that loud noise can signal danger, which can ignite a fight or flight response that can not only inhibit digestion, but also make people misinterpret social cues as hostility, which then puts everyone on edge and makes the space even less safe for everyone that's present. So the environment really does play a big factor in people's mental and physical health as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. Wayne, I want to ask you a similar question. Do you find that there are still barriers to a healthy food environment for folks after they leave prison?
Yes, well, the work that we do at the Food Trust is actually designed to identify those unhealthy barriers and try to navigate returning citizens through them. And we find that there are not only unnatural barriers that, you know, an individual that's coming from prison encounter. What we also have found that in many cases, because of what Leslie just described, we are used to eating like that. I'm gonna say that again. The conditions in which Leslie just described, to us, at some point, they become normal. That's very dangerous. When those conditions that she just described become normal, that means the transition for returning citizens when they come home, the natural home environment is no longer normal. So they have to reproduce the environment that they came from. And those are internal obstacles that we're looking at now in terms of how we approach our program with returning citizens as we're teaching nutrition. We also are aware of the condition in which they're coming from and what we are trying to navigate them through. And we do that not just with the education, nutrition, but we connect with them on an emotional level, because the emotional level allow us to convey the importance of the lesson and how that lesson can improve the quality of their life.
Thank you. Let's talk about what correctional officers eat at work. Catherine, what did you discover about meal policies for corrections workers from state to state?
Yeah, they did range. Usually you could either, some states, very few states, correctional officers could bring in their own food to eat during a shift. However, that was kind of uncommon given safety concerns. So the majority of the states that we found policy on regarding this did have similar mainline fares for staff and incarcerated people. And so these were typically the same foods. However, there were some cases in which the staff members would have explicitly stated healthier food items than the incarcerated folks. Those were the biggest differences between the two fares.
Great. So the report discusses the ritual of home cooking in prison, which is something that I want to dive deeper into in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about ramen. Leslie, can you tell us what ramen is and why it's significant to the experience of incarceration?
Yeah, instant ramen noodle packets like Top Ramen, the kind that you'd see in the grocery store, those are a staple food in prison. And many people actually rely on them to not starve while they're inside. They're generally one of the least expensive food items in the commissary, and they're easy to modify with other ingredients and condiments, other things to make soups or different kinds of dishes. And they're actually frequently used as currency for people on the inside.
Fascinating. Catherine, can you tell us a bit about purchasing food at commissary and the price gouging that occurs there? Where's that money going?
Yeah, so this is kind of a complicated question because it can depend on who is exactly running the commissary, because it could be a private provider or it could be the actual DOC of that state. However, the most common thing that happens is the cheapest items, kind of like in the real world, right? The cheapest items are the least healthiest items that are available. So ramen is cheap because, and I use air quotes for those of you who are not watching the video, because cheap does not mean the same thing as it does outside prison. So for ramen in some states, it could take like 3 hours of work, because folks who are working while inside are not making the same, they're not making a prevailing wage, they're making 25 cents to 30 cents on average. And so even if ramen is offered at 75 cents, that's 3 hours of work that someone has to do in order to afford it. Versus like mixed nuts might actually be 13 hours because they're that much more expensive. So if it's a private provider, the people making the money on that would be the private provider. However, in a lot of states where it is the DOC that's running that, the money is put back into the DOC, into that system.
Thanks for that breakdown. I want to talk about food during family visits. Leslie, what kinds of foods are available during a family visit?
The food during family visits is generally limited to options from overpriced vending machines. So it's things like chips, sodas, candy bars. Sometimes there are sandwiches. There are a handful of places around the country that will sometimes allow families to bring food in, but those are really few and far between. And the regulations for some of those are incredibly confusing. Like things like if you bring fried chicken and baked chicken, those count as two different items and you can only bring three items all together. And so, everything has to be in certain kinds of containers. So, really the limitations on what should be family time are pretty slim. I mean, the limitations are large, the options are slim.
Right. So, Catherine, how did respondents describe their food experience during family visits?
So they didn't. And I think that that's often sort of is like what the issue is there's not much to talk about, kind of like Leslie was saying. It was highlighted as sort of an area that we could put attention to, an area where maybe we should improve this in order to help impact the lives of those experiencing the system.
Right. And speaking of that, Wayne, how can the food experience during family visits be improved to provide better nutritional outcomes for the individual and their family after release?
I think it could be improved by not just, the vending machines are there, but I think other options would help. Fresh fruits, vegetables, or anything that's healthy being a part of that visit. Why? Because the visit is not just a visit and it's not just about food. It's an opportunity for parents to connect with children. If it's an incarcerated male or female, that's an opportunity for that male or female to bond with their child. And they are going to do that by nature anyway. But what we don't want, I think, is the chips as the only option as a part of the binding. We would like for them to have something that's healthy, that's not only healthy in terms of food, but I think it will help to improve the relationship between the mother, father, and the child, and the family in itself, because eating as a family is a strong component of a healthy life.
Well said. So this report mentions some unique examples of positive food experiences in prison. Leslie, what kinds of celebratory food experiences did you encounter in your research?
We heard lots of stories about birthday cakes that were made out of commissary cookies and pudding stolen from the kitchen. We heard about people pulling their supplies and making holiday meals for 80 out of ramen noodles and various other things and sharing with people who, couldn't afford to chip in. We heard about some men in Michigan who last summer created a memorial meal in honor of George Floyd. The food in these cases isn't necessarily healthy, but the experience of preparing and sharing food with others echoes that sense of normalcy on the outside and helps provide some of that much needed nourishment to people's souls. So, it's a chance to reconnect with food in a way that maybe feels a little bit more like home. And these were often the only positive stories we heard about people who were eating while they were incarcerated.
Thanks for that. I want to take a moment to discuss the illustrations in this report and the artist, Melissa Garden. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen really quickly so that I can share some of these. So I was really blown away by how incredible the art is in this report and throughout this report. So I asked Melissa, the artist, what it was like to work on this project, and she had this to say. Quote, other than cinematic depictions of food in prisons, I admit I had no real understanding of the dire state of our country's prison food systems. It was a real eye-opener and has strengthened my resolve to continue being an advocate. As an artist, I am most happy when my illustrations can be in the service of something like the incredible content that Leslie and Impact Justice created. If it can be the bait that gets them on the hook, then I've done my job. She went on to say, I was fascinated by so many aspects of the report, the holistic look at how nutrition and food affect recidivism rates, how it affects mental health, cultural expression, and most shockingly, how it's used as a punishment, and the multi-generational devastation that it can have on communities. So this is an issue that Wayne and I have discussed earlier, and Wayne brought up a moment ago. Wayne, what can you tell us about the mental health implications of food in prison? I know you started to unpack this earlier, but do you have anything else to add about that?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, it is from personal experience and personal observation. It is so deep that we that have been in prison are affected in a way that we are not aware of. And that's the real danger. It becomes normal. What I mean by that is that, how do you say that? Well, our brain do not function the same way that what we would consider a healthy brain would function. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute, because the environment that we just described, it is not an environment where we are in for a day or 2 or 3 days. What is the long-term effect of living in an environment like that, eating in a kitchen like that? It has to have effect long-term on our brain, mind, and how it functions. And I see that play out, even in my own life. I see it played out at times. When I was doing a research study, talking to interviewing returning citizens that's been home for 3 years or more, it became more clear to me how deeply we was affected in that time of incarceration, and the connection of not just the food, but the food environment, and how it actually stopped us from developing mentally in ways in which that will allow us to function once we was released.
Right. Thank you for that. I want to dive into the Q&A for just a moment. A question from an audience member. With every county and every state having their own prison policies, it's clear from this presentation that the vast majority are doing a terrible job with food. Are there prisons that we should learn from who are doing a relatively good job on this front? Leslie, can I ask you to tackle that question?
Sure. So there isn't anywhere that we would say is doing a great job, or that we would say, oh, you should look to this prison as a model for how food should be done. We did come across places with what we call promising practices that were addressing different aspects of this issue in a way that was better than in other places. So for example, there is a correctional facility in Maine that we talk about a lot, where the food service manager is an organic farmer. He believes that food can be medicine or it can be poison. He has made really strong relationships with local producers to get local fresh food into the facility kitchen. He's established a really lovely garden and apple orchard on site with food that goes directly into the kitchen. So that's an example of somewhere that's doing better. But at the same time, the diet there is still really heavy in refined carbohydrates. They still use the fortified powdered drink beverage mixes to make sure that they're reaching the nutrient requirements. So, it's still prison food, but there are places where there is an effort being made to do better. And again, like, those places are really, really few and far between. We always quote that example from Maine because it's one of the very few examples that we can actually talk about.
Yeah, thank you for that. So part 4 of this report is titled Prison Food Machine and discusses some of the major players in prison food systems. Catherine, can you give us a sense of who makes key decisions about what people in prison eat?
I feel like I've been saying this at the beginning of all of my answers, but it does depend on the state. So some states are really centralized in the Department of Corrections, and so all of the decisions can be made completely at this central location, including there are some states that make the food in one hub and then send it out to the rest of the facilities. However, what typically happens is there is the food service manager who's in charge of most of the food services, all of the food service decisions, and they will consult with a nutritionist or other sort of correctional leadership in order to approve menus. And some There are some variations allowed at the local level, at the facility level. However, that's mostly around, you can substitute this vegetable for this vegetable if you have extra vegetables on hand.
Right. So follow-up question to that. It seems like there are some disconnects between the policies and the practices here. Can you unpack some of those disconnects?
Yeah, there are definitely some big gaps between policy and practice. I think one of the best examples of this is that almost every single DOC or facility, every DOC policy states explicitly that food will never be used as a punishment. Access to food or the amount of food, it will never be used as punishment. But we heard countless examples from the people we interviewed, as well as in some of the DOC policies, that your connection to food will be reduced if a guard has deemed you misbehaving or whatnot. And that's not just like the mainline fare, right? It could be commissary. That was often an example, like you would lose your access to commissary. And we learned from our survey that most of the people who responded to our survey said that they survived because they had access to commissary. So that's one of the biggest examples. I think this is because there's a huge lack of oversight and a huge lack of accountability at a DOC level that leads this policy and practice misalignment.
Thanks for bringing up food as a punishment. I want to jump ahead to that. So you had mentioned, I think you just gave the example of how food can be limited and access to commissary can be restricted. What are some other ways, and I'll ask this question to Leslie, what are some other ways that food is used as a punishment or disciplinary practice in prisons?
So the first one that comes to mind is Nutriloaf. Nutriloaf is a purposely disgusting blend of often leftover items like bread, meat, oatmeal. It's baked into a loaf and served in slices, and it can be served as the meal for up to twice a day for up to 2 weeks for people who are in solitary confinement. It's legal in 18 states to use Nutriloaf as a punishment, and it technically meets the calorie count and the nutritional requirements. And I'd love to put air quotes around nutritional requirements because using that very loosely. But a lot of people can't actually bring themselves to eat it. And we heard stories from people who were in solitary confinement who were eating toothpaste and toilet paper just so that they could have something in their stomachs. And like Catherine said, there's this policy of we don't ever use food as a punishment. And then in practice, we heard about officers making people throw out their trays if they're caught sharing food at meals, or writing someone up for wasting food if they're throwing out something that is flat out inedible. People have been sent to solitary confinement for taking a piece of bread or fruit out of the dining area to eat as a snack later on. We read about one facility where the warden withheld food because people's hairstyles didn't comply with the facility's regulations. Sometimes officers will wait until the food is cold before serving it to people. The list goes on and on. We could talk all day about the ways that we heard that food was used as punishment.
Wow. I want to jump back into the Q&A for just a moment. Somebody from the audience asked, what could we be doing to help incarcerated people learn about good nutrition? I feel like, Wayne, this is your work. Do you want to tackle this question?
I think what we could do is, from the outside, it's important for us to understand why it is important to make nutrition an important part of reentry. Those of us, because most of us are coming back to a household. If that household is prepared to receive us on that level, that transition, both for the household and for the individual that's coming from prison, it becomes healthy. I think it's important to understand that if we can't help people to become healthy, then we can't expect them to behave healthy. So we all play a role in this in terms of trying to help people to, it's a part of rebuilding something that has been destroyed. We have to try ways in which that we can rebuild the soul of the individual, because it's not just the food, it is the self-worth and self-value of that individual that have to be part of the restorement for that individual.
We have some more great questions coming in from the Q&A, but before I jump over to those, I want to ask one more of my own. Excuse me for just a moment. So let's talk about the cost of providing healthy food in prison. So some people believe that healthier food is more expensive than unhealthy food, and this belief seeps into conversations around prison food as well. Leslie, can you tell us how food in prison can be flat out less expensive than toxic food and can save money as well?
Yeah, so just like in the real world, whole ingredients and cooking from scratch can be less expensive than pre-made and ultra-processed foods. But there is that trade-off in terms of convenience, which correctional agencies often prioritize over cost. So for example, the facility in Maine that I mentioned before, they saved a lot of money by switching from liquid egg product to whole eggs and by making all of their bread out of whole grains, making it homemade in-house. But again, that does require a lot more labor and a lot more effort. In terms of better food saving money, better food can mean less food waste. Waste is really expensive to haul out. Healthy food up front means lower healthcare costs later on, both in facilities and in communities after release. But we can't really let cost be the driving force because most correctional agencies are spending about the same amount per person per day on meals as the average elementary school spends for one child for just lunch. So again, that's all 3 meals for an adult person in one day is about the same cost as your average elementary school uses for lunch. And something else to note is that the food costs are typically about 4% of a correctional agency's annual budget, and healthcare and security costs are generally over 20% each. So it's actually possible to adjust the proportions of spending and spend more on food without increasing the budget overall.
Thanks for that breakdown. I appreciate that. So we've talked a lot about eating food in prison, but I'd like to know more about planting, harvesting, and handling food in prison. So Leslie, a follow-up question for you. What are the benefits of people in prison engaging with the food they eat in the ways I just mentioned?
Growing and preparing food in many cases can be more meaningful work, and under the right conditions, it can be healing and can help restore a sense of dignity and self-worth. And in some of the better gardening and culinary programs that exist, people are able to learn skills that can actually help them with employment on the outside, like getting a master gardener certificate or training under real professional chefs. That being said, there are many, many, many facilities where people are doing this work in poor conditions. They're all doing this work without fair wages. And in some cases, they're doing this work, farm labor, kitchen labor. It's hard work. It's really difficult on the body. In some cases, people are getting no wages at all. And in some states, they don't even get to eat the food that they're producing in the farms or the garden programs. And those higher quality gardening and culinary programs are, again, exceedingly rare.
Right. Thank you for that. Great question from the audience. Did the pandemic impact your findings or the data collected? Catherine, can I direct that question toward you?
Yes, I will talk about data all the time. So absolutely. Fortunately for us, we had actually been done with our data collection prior to the start of the pandemic. It did, however, sort of change a little bit of our spin because, I mean, the pandemic has changed everything. So that's actually not surprising. But the responses I think we've had to the pandemic definitely highlight that we really did not help out those most vulnerable, those people inside who didn't. Yeah, the pandemic showed us that we did that. And so as the report does highlight, we do include some stories of like what we read or what we heard from about how food was handled in these facilities during COVID. So we did do some like last minute additions that way, but most of the data collection had been done before then.
Wayne, how has your work changed because of COVID-19?
Our work at the Food Trust has changed because, like everyone else, we had to find ways in which to stay connected with our participants because we couldn't do in-person classes anymore. So we worked to find ways in which that we can do virtual classes. And of course, in the beginning, during shifting from in-person class to virtual classes, it was a difficult challenge, but it was also a benefit. because the benefit became, the part of the benefit was that we was also at that moment under those conditions, we was able to really connect with our participants and teach them another skill, unbeknown to ourselves. In talking to them and presenting this information on Zoom, we had discovered there was another impediment, if you will, for returning citizens. They're not computer literate, if you will. So we had to, before we could actually get to the nutrition aspect of the class, we actually had to go to the technical aspect. And that's, that's very important, because you find your success when you meet people where they at. And when people see that you are willing to meet them, the participants in our program, once they see that we are actually there to help them better understand not just nutrition, but their role in nutrition, they buy into the concept, they buy into the product, they buy into the service. And so we shift, like everyone else, we shift when COVID came, we shift, try to stay in contact with many of the participants at the sites that we was working in, staying in contact with them like once a month, trying to see what they're going through and see if and how we might be able to assist them in that pandemic.
Right. So we have another question from the audience, which asks, are there any lobbying efforts regarding reform around this topic? I'm just going to throw that out to the larger group if anybody wants to hop in and answer it.
On a national scale, no, not that we know of. Catherine, correct me if you're thinking of anything that I'm not. There are some jurisdictions where people are getting more active and involved in this, but like at the specific county level, but overall, there has not been a wave of efforts to address prison food.
So it's sort of like some of the other issues we've talked about in that it very much varies from place to place. Okay. So the last part of this report is titled A Path Forward. And this question is for everyone. What are the most important changes that can be made now to improve the quality and quantity and experience of food in prison and during reentry? So if it's all right, I'd like to start with Leslie and then move on to Catherine and Wayne. So what can be done right now?
I would suggest starting by locking up fewer people and not relying as much on a racist system to address harm. Beyond that, let's try and recognize the humanity of the people who are currently locked up. These are people's partners and parents and children and friends. 1 in 3 adult Americans has an immediate family member who has been incarcerated. Think about how you would want your loved ones to be eating and feed other people accordingly with food and eating environments that are meant to actually nourish physical and mental and emotional health rather than harm it. And I think that kind of overall larger cultural shift in perspective is a prerequisite to some of the more concrete changes that we would like to see follow.
Thank you.
And everything that Leslie said, definitely. But also, I sort of talked about this before, there is a huge lack of accountability, and there's a huge discrepancy between what the policy states and what the actual practice is. And so if any step forward is taken, there also needs to be some really concrete and effective steps towards giving voices to those people who are impacted by the system and giving voices to those people who eat this food every day and giving them more agency. So all of what Leslie said, and then also really having a robust way to actually measure what we're doing and make sure that we are not doing what we've been doing for the past.
I think it has a lot to do with both what the speaker said. We need, I think, to understand that when we devalued, how did the treatment become acceptable? It is because for people that's incarcerated, they are sought and dealt with as subhuman. We have to change that narrative if we want to change the behavior of institutions. If institutions see individuals as subhuman, then they will only and can only treat them as subhuman. We have to raise the level of awareness up and show the connection between those that's incarcerated, those that's returning from incarceration. We have to change that narrative of their value. The narrative of their value is, as Leslie said earlier, that they don't have the same value. And if they are saw as not having the same value, it is very difficult to get people to treat them in the same way that they see people that have value. So if we can help move this a little bit further down the line when we begin to see people as human beings and understand that whether we like it or not, we are all tied in this together in one way or the other. And unless we begin to look at it in that way, we would not be able to come up with an effective program to change our own thinking as it applies to not just returning citizens, but to all of us.
Thanks, everyone. And I want to conclude our program by asking one more question from the audience. What has the corporatization done to prison food? I want to open this up to everyone, but Catherine, I feel like this might be your area. Can you speak to the corporatization of food in prison?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we've heard two sides, right? On one side, private operators have been, they are subject to contract monitoring, so there are inspections that are state operated. However, on the other hand, we have heard from all of the people we interviewed and surveyed who experienced privatization in terms of their prison food, that it's a lower quality meal. On average, it's actually less money spent on private prison food than it is on state level facilities. And there is an inherent incentive to offering cheaper food as a private company, because the money goes back to the company versus the state could fund that, put that money elsewhere. It doesn't go in someone's pocket in most cases. We do have examples of where, like, one state in Alabama, I do believe, Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, that the sheriff was able to pocket the money that was saved on prison food. So it's not like a standard customer relationship where people can stop purchasing it as well, right? You don't have other options. Your other options in some states, your other option is Aramark in the dining hall, market in the commissary, or Trinity Services is probably a better example. They are one of the top prison food services, and they are often the commissary and the dining hall. And so you serve a bad food here, you still get money here. So really, it's the privatization. Capitalism works because there is someone who gets to choose a better product. You do not get that option in prison in any way, in any form. And so from the people we talked to, the resounding answer was it just has made it worse.
Right. Wow. Thank you for that. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to our panelists. I feel like this is an appropriate time for us to stop. Thank you to our CEO, Sally Elk, and to everybody who tuned in tonight. And make sure to tune in next month for Searchlight as well, May 4th. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.